Montreal's most celebrated restaurateur, believed he had built the perfect empire, until a soft-spoken waitress with shaking hands and a nursing school textbook hidden in her locker did something so unexpected that it silenced a dining room full of the city's most powerful people, exposed a betrayal 3 years in the making, and saved a woman's life between the appetizer and the main course. Sera Nakamura was 28 years old and invisible by design. Not the kind of invisible that people choose, the kind that life chooses for you, slowly, quietly, the way frost creeps across a window in November. She had been accepted to McGill's Faculty of Medicine at 22, with a scholarship that made her mother cry at the kitchen table in Verdun. She had lasted 14 months before her father's diagnosis arrived, blunt and absolute, like a door slamming shut. Stage 3. The bills followed, and then the second mortgage, and then the terrible arithmetic of choosing between rent and chemotherapy supplements. And so Sera had folded her acceptance letter into a drawer she no longer opened, put on a pair of black non-slip shoes, and learned to pour wine without leaving fingerprints on the glass. 4 years later, she was still pouring. Auberge Sainte-Cécile occupied the ground floor of a 19th-century limestone building on Rue Saint-Paul in Old Montreal, the kind of place where the bread basket cost more to produce than Sera's hourly wage, and the sommelier spoke about Burgundy the way a priest speaks about scripture. The dining room seated 42. The private room, concealed behind a frosted glass partition embossed with a stylized heron, seated 12. The head chef had 2 James Beard nominations. The head waiter, a sharp-cornered man named Thierry, had exactly 0 patience for sentiment. "You are a mechanism," Thierry told his staff during every pre-service briefing, pacing the narrow galley corridor with his hands clasped behind his back. A refined, well-calibrated mechanism. You do not have opinions, you do not have feelings, you fill glasses and remove plates and you vanish. Is that understood? It was understood. Sera understood it particularly well. Her natural quietness had made her an efficient server, the kind who anticipates refills before a glass is half empty and remembers without writing down that the gentleman at table 4 is allergic to tree nuts. Thierry used her primarily as a runner, ferrying plates between the kitchen pass and the lead servers, staying out of the way, staying out of conversations. She didn't mind. The tips were pooled. The shift ended at 11. She took the metro home, ate rice with whatever her father could manage to eat that week, and studied pharmacology from a borrowed textbook until she fell asleep with the lamp still on. That was her life. It was small and exhausting, and hers. The reservation had been made 6 weeks in advance under the name Aldrich, a name that made Thierry straighten his already rigid spine when he saw it on the manifest that Thursday afternoon. Patrice Aldrich was not someone whose name appeared on reservation sheets. Patrice Aldrich had restaurants' name tables after him. At 63, he was the founder and majority shareholder of Aldrich Hospitality Group, which owned 11 hotels, 4 private members' clubs, and a Michelin-recognized tasting room in Quebec City that had a 14-month wait list. He was the kind of man who didn't dine out so much as grant an establishment the opportunity to perform for him. He was coming with 2 guests. His son, Callum Aldrich, 37, who had taken over day-to-day operations of the group 8 months ago and was, by every account in the business press, doing so with intimidating competence. And a third name, Geneviève Roux, identified on the reservation note as Callum's fiancée. No mention of anyone else. Thierry pulled Sera aside 90 minutes before service. "You're on the private room tonight, running only. You do not speak to the Aldrich table unless directly addressed. You pour water, you carry plates, you disappear. If anything goes wrong, nothing will go wrong," Sera said, because it was the answer he wanted. "If anything goes wrong," Thierry repeated, as though she hadn't spoken, "I will be in the dining room. You come to me. You do not improvise. You do not have ideas. You execute." She nodded. He walked away. The Aldrich party arrived at 7:15. Sera watched them from the service alcove as the maître led them through the frosted partition into the private room. Callum Aldrich came first, tall in a charcoal suit that had clearly been made for him, not purchased. He had the particular exhaustion of someone who was always being watched and had learned to hold it in his jaw. Geneviève Roux followed on his arm, striking in a way that seemed effortful. A deep plum dress, immaculate posture, eyes that swept the room once and catalogued everything of value. And behind them, moving carefully, was a woman Sera had not been told to expect. She was perhaps 65. She wore a camel wool blazer and ivory trousers, and her silver hair was cut into a clean, precise bob that suggested she had once cared a great deal about her appearance, and still did, quietly, out of habit. She moved with a slight hesitation at each threshold, pausing a half-second before steps, pressing her fingertips briefly against the back of Callum's chair before lowering herself into the seat beside him. Her name, Sera, would only learn later, was Elspeth Aldrich, Callum's mother, Patrice's ex-wife, a woman who had built the original Aldrich brand from a single roadside inn in the Eastern Townships in 1987, and then, after the divorce, had been systematically erased from the company's official history. She was also, though no one had told Auberge Sainte-Cécile this, almost entirely blind. And Sera didn't know. What she noticed first was smaller, the way Elspeth sat down and immediately reached for the menu, then held it at an odd angle under the candlelight, tilting it toward the sconce on the wall. The way her eyes tracked the room differently from how sighted people scan a space, not darting from point to point, but moving in careful, deliberate arcs, like someone triangulating by sound and peripheral shadow. The way she didn't reach for the water glass until Callum said something, and she followed his voice, placing her hand beside his and locating the glass by proximity. Sera had spent 4 months in a geriatric ward before her medical studies ended. She recognized low vision when she saw it. She also noticed something else. When the maître presented the menu to the table, Geneviève reached over without a word and turned Elspeth's copy face down, a gentle gesture, performed with a smile. And Elspeth's hand moved to find the menu again, patting the tablecloth, finding nothing, and then going still. It was so smoothly done that no one else saw it. Sera saw it. She filled the water glasses and retreated to the service alcove and stood very still for a moment, listening to the tight small voice in her chest that had learned, over years of watching her father lose things slowly and quietly, to recognize when someone was being managed rather than helped. The dinner progressed. Thierry's lead server, a polished young man named Felix, handled the table with fluent expertise, presenting the evening's tasting menu in French and English and deferring to Callum on all wine choices. Patrice Aldrich had not materialized, apparently delayed. Felix reported quietly to Thierry between courses, though no explanation was given. At the table, the dynamic settled into a shape Sera recognized from the outside in. Callum was distracted, not rudely so, but in the specific way of someone who has been mentally in a meeting since before they arrived for dinner. His phone face down on his knee, but his eyes still doing the calculation behind his pleasant expression. Geneviève was attentive to him, and only to him, leaning in when he spoke, laughing at the right intervals, managing the conversation with the smooth efficiency of someone who had studied how to be charming the way others study for bar exams. Elspeth sat between them and said very little. She was not ignored, exactly. Callum touched her hand once when he laughed. Geneviève addressed her twice, briefly, but no one narrated the room for her, No one described the dish as it arrived. When Felix delivered the first course, a delicate scallop crudo garnished with micro herbs and a pool of green oil, he set the plate in front of Elspeth without a word, and she found it with her fingertips along the edge of the china before she knew what she was eating. She ate slowly, carefully, alone in the middle of the table, in a way that had nothing to do with the seat she occupied. Sera carried the second course plates in and stood to the side while Felix presented them, and she watched Elspeth's hand close around her fork and then pause, hovering above a plate she couldn't see, waiting for some context that never came. The medical textbook in Sera's locker had a chapter on macular degeneration. She knew that central vision loss left peripheral sight partially intact. She knew that people with low vision often developed compensatory skills, heightened spatial memory, sensitivity to contrast. She knew that what they needed, more than pity, more than efficiency, was information. She also knew that Thierry would fire her for what she was about to do. The thought arrived and departed like a bus she had already missed. Sera set her tray down on the service stand and walked to Elspeth's side of the table. She leaned down, close enough to speak softly, below the ambient noise of the room. "Mrs. Aldrich," she said. Her voice was quiet and level. "Your second course is a duck confit, sliced at 12 o'clock on the plate. There's a parsnip puree at 6 o'clock and a cherry reduction at 3. The garnish is microcress, edible, very mild." Elspeth went entirely still. Then she turned her head toward Sera's voice, and what Sera saw on that face, the sudden fierce relief of someone who has been adrift and has just felt the current shift, made Sera's throat close around a breath she couldn't release. "Thank you," Elspeth said, very quietly. Just that, 2 syllables, but her hand found the fork with certainty now, and she brought it to the 12 o'clock position with the confidence of someone who finally knew where they were. Across the table, Genevieve's expression did not change, but her eyes moved to Sera with the flat, assessing attention of someone filing something away. Felix materialized at Sera's elbow the moment she stepped back, his jaw set. "What are you doing?" he murmured, barely moving his lips. "My job," Sera said. "Your job is running plates. I will handle the table." "Then handle it," Sera said, still quietly. "Tell her what she's eating." Felix looked at her for a moment. Then he turned back to the table, and something shifted in his expression, a small, slightly ashamed recalibration, and when he spoke to the table again, he included Elspeth in the description. Genevieve did not acknowledge this. She turned to Callum and said something that made him smile, and the conversation moved on. But Sera was watching Genevieve's hand, resting beside her own wineglass, and she noticed that it wasn't entirely still. The fingers were tight, not relaxed, the hand of someone calculating. The third course arrived. Thierry appeared briefly at the partition, scanned the room, and gave Sera a look she translated accurately as, "Do not make me come back in here." She gave him a neutral nod and went to the kitchen for the next plates. She was at the pass when Felix came through the partition, his face arranged into careful blankness. "Genevieve just told me to change Elspeth's dessert course," he said, speaking to the counter rather than to Sera. "She said Elspeth has a lactose sensitivity. She wants to substitute the île flottante for the sorbet trio." Sera picked up a plate. Did Elspeth say that? Genevieve said Elspeth has trouble communicating it herself in unfamiliar settings. The île flottante was a floating island. Meringue, crème anglaise, praline, classic. No citrus. The sorbet trio, Sera knew from memorizing the menu that afternoon, included a blood orange sorbet, a lemon verbena, and a grapefruit granita. 3 citrus elements. She set the plate down. "Has anyone asked Elspeth directly?" Felix looked at her. "Genevieve is the one who made the reservation." "I know who made the reservation." Sera kept her voice even, I'm asking if anyone has spoken to Elspeth about her own dessert." A silence opened between them in the stainless steel air of the kitchen pass. "I'll handle it," Felix said, and went back through the partition. Sera waited. She counted plates on the pass. She listened to the soft percussion of the kitchen, the clatter, the hiss, the compressed air urgency of a service in full swing. She thought about her father, who had spent 8 months having decisions made for him by well-meaning people. Before Sera had learned to ask him directly and discover that he wanted black tea instead of herbal, that he hated the afternoon nurse's perfume, that he had a very specific opinion about which blanket he preferred, and that no one had thought to ask him. She thought about what it means to be in a room full of people who are talking about you without talking to you. She went back through the partition. Felix was at the wine station, and Genevieve was speaking to Callum in a low voice, her hand on his forearm, and Elspeth was sitting with her hands folded on the tablecloth, looking at nothing in the particular way of some waiting to be told what happens next. Sera walked to Elspeth's side. "Mrs. Aldrich," she said, same quiet register, "I want to confirm your dessert preference before we bring the course. We have 2 options this evening. The first is our île flottante, a meringue with vanilla cream and praline. The second is a sorbet trio, which is fruit-based, quite tart, with citrus flavors. Do you have a preference or any allergies I should know about?" Elspeth's chin came up. It was a small motion, but something happened in her expression, a reorganization, a gathering, and when she spoke, her voice was entirely clear. "I am severely allergic to citrus," she said. "Anaphylactic. I carry an EpiPen." She paused, "and I would very much like the île flottante." The table went quiet. Callum turned from Genevieve mid-sentence. His eyes went to his mother, then to Genevieve. Genevieve's smile remained in place for exactly 1 second longer than it should have. "Darling," she said to Callum, her voice light, amused, "I already told the server about your mother's dairy issue. I don't know why she's asking again." "Elspeth, you know the cream bothers you." Elspeth turned her face toward Genevieve's voice. Her expression was very calm. "I have never had a dairy allergy in my life," she said, "but I have been allergic to citrus since I was 6 years old. You have known this for 2 years, Genevieve. You were sitting beside me when I had a reaction at your aunt's dinner in Outremont. A sound that was not quite silence and not quite noise moved through the room." Callum sat back very slowly in his chair, the gesture of a man who has just felt the ground move under his feet. "That's not," Genevieve began. "And I would like to speak to my son," Elspeth continued, still in that quiet, clear voice, "without you answering for me." Callum was looking at Genevieve now. The pleasant professional expression had left his face entirely. What replaced it was something rawer. Not anger yet, but the first cold edge of a question he didn't want to ask. "Genevieve," he said, and the single word held the compressed weight of everything he was not yet saying. "Did you order the sorbet for my mother?" "Callum, she gets confused in new settings. The doctors said her vision is deteriorating." His voice was very controlled. "They said nothing about confusion. That's something you started saying this past spring." He turned to look at Elspeth. "Mum, did you order the sorbet? At any point tonight, did you tell anyone you wanted the sorbet?" "I did not," Elspeth said. "I did not order anything tonight. I haven't been given the opportunity to order anything tonight." Callum put down his wine glass. He looked at Genevieve with the focused attention of a man running a very fast calculation in his head. Genevieve shifted in her chair, and the movement was almost imperceptible, but Sera caught it. The same micro-adjustment she had noticed in the hand, the kind of movement that people make when they are rapidly revising what they are about to say. "You've been handling all of Mum's medical correspondence," Callum said. "Not a question," Since March, you said it was too stressful for her, that she was getting overwhelmed. She was. She is. Callum, I don't know why you're making this. Her ophthalmologist sent a report 2 months ago, Callum said quietly. I never saw it. You told me there was nothing new. Elspeth's hands moved on the tablecloth, not nervously, precisely. She was reaching for something, the edge of the table, to orient herself. Then she turned toward where Callum's voice was coming from, and she said, The report recommended me for a low-vision rehabilitation program. I asked Genevieve to book the intake appointment in April. She told me she had. Last week I called the clinic myself, because I had not heard anything, and they had no record of a referral. The candles on the table had not moved, but the light in the room seemed to have shifted. Callum looked at the woman he was engaged to marry in 6 weeks. Genevieve looked back at him, and in the silence between them, something that had been building for a long time finally became visible to the person it had been most carefully hidden from. Sera stood absolutely still. She understood, now, the shape of what she had walked into. Elspeth Aldrich still held a 22% stake in Aldrich Hospitality Group, retained in the divorce settlement, non-dilutable, until she either sold or was legally declared incapable of managing her own financial affairs. Genevieve had been managing Elspeth's care, controlling her correspondence, intercepting her medical reports, telling Callum, steadily and gently and over many months, that his mother's mind was softening, that she needed more structure, that perhaps a memory care facility in the Laurentians would give her the consistency she needed, that the stress of managing shares and attending board meetings was only accelerating her decline. Sera had not known all of this 40 minutes ago. Elspeth had told her, in fragments, in the brief and careful sentences of someone who had been waiting, without much hope, for a moment exactly like this one. She had told her while Callum and Genevieve were discussing wine. She had leaned toward Sera when Sera leaned in to describe the duck, and she had said, very quietly, under the ambient noise of the dining room, I don't need you to feel sorry for me. I need you to ask me a question in front of my son. Just that, one request, from a woman who had spent months being answered for, managed around, spoken past, and slowly positioned at the edge of her own life. Callum, Elspeth said now into the quiet, I am not confused. I am not declining. I have macular degeneration, which affects my central vision, and I have learned to navigate it, and I would like very much to attend the rehabilitation program and learn to navigate it better. I am 64 years old. I ran a company from a roadside inn into a national brand, and I would like the opportunity to remain a coherent participant in my own affairs. But I have been unable to communicate any of this because I have not been alone with you in 4 months. Callum's jaw moved. He looked at his mother. Then he looked at the woman beside him in the plum dress, and his face did something that was very quiet and very final. Genevieve, he said, I need you to leave. Callum, you're being. I need you to leave the table, he said, still in that same controlled register, and I need you to go home, and I need you not to contact my mother or her doctors or her financial advisors or anyone associated with the group until I have spoken to our lawyers. Am I being clear? Genevieve stood up, her composure held until she reached for her coat, and then Sera saw her hands, and they were shaking, not with remorse. With the particular vibration of someone whose plan has just collapsed and who is already beginning to build the next one. She left without looking at Elspeth. The sound of her heels on the hardwood faded through the dining room, and Sera heard, distantly, the soft exhalation of the front door. Callum sat with his mother for a long moment. Neither of them spoke. He reached across the table and found her hand, and she turned hers over and held his, and they stayed like that while the candles burned and the kitchen moved on to the next course for other tables in other rooms. Then Callum looked up at Sera. She had stepped back, as she always did, to the edge of the room, trying to take up less space. "You could have walked away," he said. "You could have changed the dessert and said nothing." "Yes," Sera said. "Why didn't you?" She thought of her father, the afternoon nurse's perfume, the wrong blanket. 8 months of decisions made on behalf of a man who still had preferences, still had opinions, still had a self that was being quietly administered around. Because no one asked her, Sera said. She was sitting at her own dinner, and no one asked her what she wanted. Callum was quiet for a moment. Then, "What's your name?" "Sera Nakamura." He nodded slowly. Behind him, Thierry had appeared at the partition, silent, watching, the expression of a man rapidly revising his understanding of the evening. Elspeth spoke then. Her voice was steady, and underneath the steadiness was something that had been compressed for a long time and was now very slowly, carefully unclenching. "Sera," she said, rolling the name once, getting the measure of it. "I once had an assistant who told me that the most dangerous person in any room is the one everyone has decided not to see." She paused. "I have been thinking about that a great deal lately." Sera didn't answer. There wasn't an answer for that, only the strange, quiet fact of being witnessed. Callum reached inside his jacket and produced a card, plain, no logo, just a name and a number in small, clean type. He set it on the edge of the table near Sera. "I am going to spend the next several days in some very unpleasant conversations with lawyers," he said. "After that, my mother is going to need a dedicated support contact. Someone to accompany her to medical appointments, liaise with her rehabilitation team, help her manage correspondence. It requires discretion, a medical background of some kind, and the ability to tell the truth in uncomfortable rooms." He looked at her steadily. "I realize that's a significant ask from someone you met 40 minutes ago over a duck confit." Sera looked at the card. She thought about the textbook in her locker. She thought about the pharmacology chapter she had been on for 3 weeks because she kept falling asleep before the end. She thought about her father, who was getting better, slowly, incrementally, in the way that people do when someone is finally paying attention. "I have a medical background," she said. "Incomplete. I left McGill in 2nd year." "Why? My father got sick. Is he still sick?" "He's improving." Callum nodded once. The position would allow for flexible hours and could accommodate ongoing study, if that was relevant. Thierry, from the partition, made a sound that might have been a cough and might have been the sound of a man swallowing his objections whole. Elspeth smiled. It was a small smile, private, directed at some internal point of recognition rather than at the room. "She forgot to bring the bread," she said mildly. "First course, no bread basket, I noticed." Callum blinked. Then, for the first time since he had walked through the frosted partition 2 hours ago, he laughed. Real, unguarded, the laugh of someone whose chest has finally released something it has been holding. Sera felt the corners of her own mouth move, involuntary, surprised by it. "The bread," she said, "was an oversight I deeply regret." "I think," Elspeth said, and there was a warmth in her voice now that had not been there at the beginning of the evening, the warmth of someone who has been cold for a long time and has finally come inside, "that we can overlook the bread." Sera picked up the card from the tablecloth. She didn't say yes, not quite yet, because she was 28 years old and careful, and she had learned not to count on things before they were real. But she held the card in her hand, and she looked at Elspeth Aldrich, who was sitting up straight now, both hands folded on the table with a composure that was no longer performed, and who was facing the room with the particular expression of someone who has just remembered what it feels like to be present in their own life. Sera slipped the card into her apron pocket, next to her pen and her folded side towel, and the small, laminated allergy chart she carried because she had learned, in 4 years of service, that the most important information is almost always the information no one thinks to give you. She went back to the kitchen to tell them to hold the dessert course for table 1, and also to ask whether it was too late to bring out the bread. It was not too late. It was, in fact, exactly the right time.